Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, the federal budget is more than just a long list of numbers, which in this case adds up to about $2.9 trillion. The federal budget, like any family budget or any company budget, is a statement of values and priorities. In fact, the federal budget in many ways is a statement of what our country is all about. We would all, I think, find it irresponsible and strange if a family that we knew spent all of their money on an expensive vacation but forgot to put aside money for the mortgage or the rent, and suddenly the family and their kids found themselves out on the street. We would say, my goodness, that is irresponsible. The family was spending money where they shouldn't have been and not spending it where they should. Preparing the federal budget and analyzing the federal budget is exactly the same process. It's about spending the money of the people of the United States of America. It's about deciding where we should spend it and where we should not spend it. It is looking at the American people as a family. It's about taking a hard look at the needs of our people and prioritizing the budget in an intelligent and a rational way. Mr. President, let me take a quick glance at the economic reality facing the middle class, the working families of our country, tens and tens of millions of Americans and their kids. Since President Bush has been in office, more than 5 million Americans have slipped into poverty, including over 1 million children. Not only does the United States of America have the highest rate of poverty of any major country on earth, we also shamefully have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, with almost 18% of our children living in poverty. Today, 37 million Americans live in poverty and 13 million are children. Last year, in the richest nation in the history of the world, 35 million of our fellow Americans struggled to put food on the table. And the Agricultural Department recently reported that the number of the poorest, hungriest Americans keep rising. In America today, hunger is a growing problem. Mr. President, we have a crisis in our nation in terms of affordable housing. Millions of working families in my state of Vermont and all over this country are paying 50 to 60% of their limited incomes for housing, and there are, as we well know, other families who are either living in their cars or living out on the streets, in some cases with their children, in America. Mr. President, last year there were 1.2 million home foreclosures in this country. 1.2 million, an increase of 42% since 2005. The cost of energy has rapidly risen since President Bush has been in office. Oil prices have more than doubled, and gasoline prices have gone up by 70% since January of 2001. This increase in energy prices, in gas prices, is putting a huge strain on people from all over this country, including workers in rural states like Vermont, who have to travel long distances to get to their jobs. Mr. President, as is well known, many middle-class families in our country today are finding it increasingly difficult to afford the escalating cost of a college education, with average tuition and other costs increasing rapidly, with the result that many families are now saying we can't send our kids to college, while other young people are graduating college deeply in debt. In America today, millions of our workers are working longer hours for lower wages, and median income for working-age families has declined for 5 years in a row. Today, incredible as it may sound, the personal savings rate is below zero, which has not happened since the Great Depression. In other words, all over this country, working people and people in the middle class are purchasing groceries, they're purchasing gas at the pump, they're purchasing other basic necessities through their credit cards, and in the process are going deeper and deeper into debt. Mr. President, over the last 6 years, we have lost in this country 3 million manufacturing jobs, often good-paying manufacturing jobs, including 10,000 in my small state of Vermont. Many of the new jobs that are available to those displaced workers, if they're lucky enough to find new jobs, will pay wages and benefits substantially lower than the jobs that they have lost. Mr. President, it is no secret that in America today our health care system is disintegrating. I think there is very little dispute about that. Health care costs are soaring, and today we have 46.6 million Americans with zero health insurance, an increase of 6.8 million since President Bush has been in office. Today, 3 million fewer American workers have pension coverage than when President Bush took office, and half of private sector American workers have no pension coverage whatsoever. Throughout our country, American workers who now work the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world, husbands working long hours, wives working long hours, people being stressed out by having to work so hard in order to earn the living that they need in order to pay for their basic needs, people are finding it harder and harder to come up with jobs, to get jobs which provide them with a decent amount of vacation time. The 2-week vacation is something that many workers no longer can have in this country. Mr. President, while the middle class is shrinking and while poverty is increasing in our country, there is another reality that is taking place, and that is that the wealthiest 1%, the people at the very top of the economic ladder, have never had it so good since the 1920s. Middle class is shrinking, poverty is increasing, and the people on the top are doing phenomenally well. According to Forbes magazine, the collective net worth of the wealthiest 400 Americans increased by $120 billion last year to $1.25 trillion. 400 families, $1.25 trillion in worth. The 400 wealthiest Americans are worth an unbelievable amount of money, and their wealth is soaring. Sadly, however, Mr. President, the United States today has the most unfair distribution of wealth and income of any major country, and the gap between the very wealthy and everyone else is growing wider. This was a country formed around egalitarian principles. We are all in it together. When one goes up, others go up. And yet what we are seeing today in an almost unprecedented way is the people on the top make it out like bandits, earning huge increases in their incomes and their wealth, while the middle class shrinks and poverty increases. Today, the wealthiest 13,000 families in our country own nearly as much income as do the bottom 20 million families. 13,000, 20 million. And the wealthiest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Mr. President, I've given you a very brief sketch of the economy in terms of how it impacts the middle class and working families of our country. Let me, within that context of what's happening to tens of millions of Americans, take a look at the President's budget. The President's budget, at a time of a major health care crisis, more and more Americans uninsured, underinsured, President's budget would cut Medicare and Medicaid by $280 billion over the next decade, lowering the quality of health care for approximately 43 million senior citizens and people with disabilities who depend on Medicare, and more than 50 million Americans who rely on Medicaid. At a time when our child care and early childhood education system is totally inadequate to meet the needs of working parents, the Bush budget reduces the number of children receiving child care assistance by 300,000. Child care in crisis, President's response, denied child care to 300,000 children. In addition, President's budget provides a $100 million cut for the Head Start program at a time when only about one-half of the children eligible for this important and excellent program actually participate in it due to a lack of funding. Huge numbers of kids can't get into Head Start. President's response, cut Head Start funding. Mr. President, while hunger in this country, as I mentioned earlier, is shamefully increasing, the President's budget denies food stamps to 280,000 families and eliminates nutrition assistance to over 400,000 senior citizens, mothers, and newborn children. We are in a war in Iraq. We're in a war in Afghanistan. The number of our veterans is increasing. 22,000 have been wounded, many seriously. Many will come back to this country with post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet, the President has significantly cut funding for the VA over a period of years, and some years ago, threw hundreds of thousands of veterans off of VA, made them ineligible to get VA health care. Mr. President, in this great country, with so many people struggling desperately to keep their heads above water, we should not be cutting back on health care. We should not be cutting back on nutritional benefits. We should not be cutting back on Head Start, affordable housing, the needs of our veterans, and educational opportunities for middle-class families. That is what we should not be doing. This is especially true when the President's budget provides $739 billion in tax breaks over the next decade to households with incomes exceeding $1 million per year. The average tax break for this group of millionaires will total $162,000 by the year 2012. Mr. President, let me be very blunt. In my view, it is wrong. In my view, it is immoral to give huge tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, the people who need them the least, while cutting back on the needs of the middle class and working families of our country. That is wrong. Mr. President, is this budget, the President's budget, a reflection of the values of the people of our country? I do not believe that. I do not believe that ordinary Americans think that it is right and appropriate to give tax breaks to billionaires, then provide inadequately for our veterans, for our children, and for our seniors. That is not, in my view, what America is about. We are told over and over again that we just don't have the money to reduce childhood poverty in this country. We are told that we don't have the funds to wipe out the disgrace of hunger in America. We are told that we don't have enough money to make sure that the young people who graduate high school in this country, who are excited about going to college, will be able to do so without coming out deeply in debt. We don't have the money to help those families. Yet, while we turn our backs on the middle class and working families of our country, it appears that we have plenty of money for the millionaires and billionaires of this country. We have tens of billions, in fact, to shower on those who need it least, yet we have nothing, and we are cutting back on the programs for those who need it most. Mr. President, included in the President's budget amazingly, is the complete repeal of the estate tax, which would take effect at the end of 2010. As you know, the complete repeal of this tax would benefit only the top 0.2% of 1% of the American people. Let me repeat that. The complete repeal of the estate tax would benefit solely the upper 0.2% of 1% of the American population. These are families, of course, who are already millionaires and billionaires, and these are families who, in the current economy, have been doing exceedingly well. In other words, 99.8% of Americans would not benefit by one nickel from the complete repeal of the estate tax as proposed by the President. According to the President's budget, this repeal of the estate tax would reduce receipts for the Treasury by more than $91 billion over the next 5 years and more than $442 billion over the next decade. But the long-term damage to our fiscal solvency is even worse. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, repealing the estate tax would cost over $1 trillion from 2012 to 2021. Over $1 trillion. In other words, if the President's plan to permanently repeal the estate tax succeeds, the children and family members of the very few of the most privileged families in America will reap a massive tax break. Instead of closing the gap between the rich and the poor, instead of addressing the huge national debt and deficit problems that we have, we make both situations worse by fully repealing the estate tax. Mr. President, I have brought with me a few charts to demonstrate who are the winners and losers in the President's budget. And obviously, fortunes go up and down, and we don't know what anyone is going to be worth tomorrow, let alone in the coming years. And the estimates that I'm giving to you and the charts that I am using are based on two reports. The first is an April 2006 report by United for a Fair Economy and Public Citizen entitled Spending Millions to Save Billions, reflecting the financial position of the wealthiest 400 Americans in this country as compiled by Forbes magazine from the year 2005. The second is a May 30th, 2006 report from the House Government Reform Committee entitled, quote, Estimated Tax Savings of Oil Company CEOs, end of quote. Of course, no one can predict what the numbers will be in the years to come. But these are the best figures available to us at this time. Let me go to the first chart, Mr. President. The granddaddy of all of the winners under the Bush budget is none other than the heirs to the Walmart fortune. If the estate tax was completely repealed, the entire Walton family would receive an estimated tax break of $32.7 billion. That's with a B. $32.7 billion in tax relief for one family, which today happens to be one of the wealthiest families in this country already. Meanwhile, in contrast, the President's budget proposes to cut Medicaid by $28 billion over the next decade, driving up the cost of health care for tens of millions of Americans. In other words, while one of the wealthiest families in this country gets a tax break of over $30 billion, tens of millions of Americans, children, seniors will suffer. Now, that may make sense to someone, that may appear to be fair to someone, but it sure doesn't make sense to me. In other words, if the President's proposed budget passes, millions of Americans will lose, including some of the most vulnerable people in our country, while one very wealthy family wins. A second major beneficiary of the president's tax cuts are the heirs of the Mars candy bar fortune. Now, Mr. President, I like Snickers as much as anybody, and I don't want to be seen here as attacking Snickers, one of the basic food groups of American society. But the Mars family, but the family that owns Mars are slated to receive an estimated $11.7 billion tax break if the estate tax is fully repealed. $11.7 billion for the Mars family. They are winners, yet who are the losers? As I mentioned earlier, all over this country there are waiting lines for veterans to get into VA hospitals. We're not keeping our promises to the veterans. Veterans lose while one family wins big time. I think that that is wrong. Another major winner in the president's budget is the Cox family, and they are the heirs to the Cox cable fortune. They will gain $9.7 billion if the estate tax is repealed. Meanwhile, while the Cox family would receive almost $10 billion in tax breaks, the president wants to cut funding for education by $1.5 billion. The president keeps talking about no child left behind while his budget continues to leave, in fact, millions of children behind. In Vermont and all over this country, school districts are struggling with grossly inadequate funding for special education. The president also wants to cut. We don't have the money to fund special education, to improve public education in America. We don't have that money, but we do have $9.7 billion for one family, the Mars family. Another major beneficiary of the president's budget is the Nordstrom family, owners of the upscale department store chain. By repealing the estate tax, the Nordstrom family stands to receive an estimated $826 million tax break, according to the April 2006 report from United for a Fair Economy. Meanwhile, tax breaks of over $800 million for an enormously wealthy family, and yet we see a $630 million cut in the president's budget for the Community Services Block Grant Program. And as you know, Mr. President, the Community Services Block Grant Program provides the infrastructure necessary to deliver services to 15 million of the lowest income people in our country. These are people who are hungry. When they're hungry, they go to the Community Action Program. When they're homeless, they go to the Community Action Program. When they don't have any money to buy food, they go to the Community Action Program. We're going to cut back on that program, but we do have $826 million in tax breaks for the Nordstrom family. Another major beneficiary of the Bush budget is the family of Ernest Gallo, who would receive a $468 million tax break. $468 million. Meanwhile, the president proposes to cut $420 million from the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, the LIHEAP program. According to the latest available data, 5.4 million senior citizens on fixed incomes and low-income families with kids receive help paying their heating bills through this program each and every year. In the state of Vermont, trust me, it gets very, very cold. And we have a lot of people in Vermont and throughout this country who are dependent upon the LIHEAP program. But as a nation, the president suggests, no, we're going to cut $420 million from LIHEAP, which impacts the lives of low-income senior citizens. But guess what? We do have $468 million available as a tax break for the Gallo family. Mr. President, the CEO of ExxonMobil does very, very well from the president's tax breaks, the former CEO, I should say. As some will remember, while the cost of gas at the pumps was soaring, while the profits of ExxonMobil were soaring, the company decided in its wisdom, in its generosity, to provide a $400 million retirement package for their departing CEO, Mr. Lee Raymond. And now the President wants to reward Mr. Raymond by providing his estate with an estimated $164 million tax breaks. $164 million tax break for the family of Lee Raymond. And yet, on the other hand, there is a program called the Commodity Supplemental Food Program. Commodity Supplemental Food Program provides a package of high-quality, nutritious food to some 480,000 seniors, mothers, and children. The President wants to eliminate this program. He is saying to the 4,000 seniors in Vermont who benefit from this program, the almost 500,000 seniors, mothers, and kids who benefit from this package of food once a month, we in America don't have enough money to provide for you who are hungry, for you who are old. Can't do it. But if you're the former CEO of ExxonMobil, if you got a $400 million bonus at the end of your career, guess what? Your family will get a $164 million tax break. Mr. President, as a member of the Senate Budget Committee, it appears to me that the choice that we as a Congress are facing and that the American people are facing are pretty clear. And that is, do we continue to shower huge tax breaks on millionaires and billionaires, people who are already doing phenomenally well, while we cut back on the needs of the middle class, working families, and the most vulnerable people in this country? Mr. President, it all comes down to the phrase, which side are we on? Are we on the side of those people who make huge campaign contributions to Congress and to the White House, or are we on the side of tens of millions of working families who are struggling hard to keep their heads above water? That is the choice that we face. As a member of the Senate Budget Committee, I think the answer is pretty obvious. I will not be voting to provide a tax break to the heirs of the Walmart fortune. Rather, I will be fighting to substantially increase financial aid for low and middle class families so that every American, regardless of income, can receive a college education. I will not support another tax cut for the former CEO of ExxonMobil and his family. Instead, I will be voting to give support to working families all over this country who are desperately seeking quality and affordable child care. Mr. President, if as a nation we are serious about addressing the long-neglected needs of the middle class and working people of our country and creating a fairer and more egalitarian society, we have got to invest in education, in health care, in housing, in our infrastructure. We have got to deal with the crisis of global warming and sustainable energy, as well as many, many other areas. We also have to reduce our national debt. Given that reality, in my view, Mr. President, Congress must develop the courage to stand up to the big money interest, to the wealthiest families in this country. We must roll back the tax breaks given to the wealthiest 1%, and we must demand that these people, fortunate people, rejoin American society and understand that, like everybody else in this country, they are part of America and not just a special breed. If we are to keep faith with our kids, with our seniors, with our veterans, with those people who have no health insurance, we can do no less. And I look forward in working with my colleagues to make sure that we do just that. Thank you very much, Mr. President.